let me introduce myself. My name is Mark Gardner. I work for UMB Financial Corporation. Up until about 4 months ago, I was co-workers with this guy here. His name is Nor Creedley at the Federal Reserve System. So the UMB made me an offer not too long ago that I couldn't say no to, and I jumped ship. So that's where I am now. I have been doing Linux administration for about the last, I can't remember how long, like 15 years now, which is weird considering I'm only 35. So yes, I've been doing it for ever since I could do anything. My very first Linux distribution is I bought a boxed set of Mandrake Linux from Hastings, of all places. It was a really random buy, and then my friend got really, really jealous, and so he went out and downloaded, which took, I think, 2.5 days, a Red Hat distribution from the internet, back when you could do that. All right, so what I want to talk about today is I'm going to talk about two-factor authentication on Linux using SSSD. I learned yesterday, or day before yesterday, that's actually how it's supposed to be pronounced, not SSSD, because you end up getting one too many or one too few S's in there. So it's SSSD. So there's one thing that you can learn. And then really what this particular solution is built on. So I'm actually doing this on eDirectory 9 with iManager 3. With the, you have to have this little utility. It comes bundled with nmaz, if anyone's familiar with that. So, and then a YubiKey personalization tool, and I think I've got good screenshots of the personalization tool. At the very end, when slides were due, I was very, very hurried, and my presentation was not complete. So I finished up as best I could and sent it in, and then realized that there's a whole lot of missing information. And so at the very end, I also give you the address to my weblog, where I have the rest of the story, and much more details and some corrected mistakes. So who actually has ever seen a YubiKey? Like a couple guys. Now I'm panicking because I can't find mine. All right. This is a silent panic here. And we're going to get to a slightly more violent panic here in a little bit, because that's my demo. So a YubiKey, in essence, is really just a hardware-based device. It looks like a USB drive, and you plug it in. Did I stick it up here? Oh, it's right here on the floor. Found it. All right. Okay. So I've actually got a couple of them here. I'm going to stand up here. Oh, there's another mic there. Good, I turned that one off. All right, so YubiKey, it looks kind of like this. It's a hardware-based device. It plugs into your computer. It registers itself as a keyboard. And then every time you touch it, it's going to generate a one-time password. Okay. YubiKeys have a default mode, which is the YubiCo mode, where your one-time password is actually going to have, it's like 32 digits long, but the first 12 digits are actually static, which is your token identifier. We're actually taking these little YubiKeys and we're actually reprogramming them using a YubiKey personalization tool to use an OAuth method that is very similar to Google Authenticator. So we're going to go down there, and I think I've got a slide on that one there, but I just kind of wanted to let everyone see, stupid wire, what they look like. So when I said doing eDirectory 9, this also works on eDirectory 8.8 and I believe 8.7. I don't remember what service pack, but one of the later versions of 8.7. If you're still on 8.7, I feel very bad. If not, cool. You have to have a certificate authority and have an intruder detection for lockout. These are not necessarily hard prerequisites, but they're kind of like best practices. And a password policy that enables universal password. That one does become important later because of the way that eDirectory handles passwords. So we're going to also, in eDirectory 9, instead of just having RSA certificates, it also does elliptical curve certificates that you can use to help protect things. It actually uses it, instead of the admin user logging into every single tree in every single server in your tree, they use elliptical cryptography certificates to backsign and authenticate to each other using certificates, which turns out is much, much faster. Okay, hashed one-time passwords. So if you've got, so has anyone ever used Google Authenticator or seen like the RSA key fobs? So every minute or 30 seconds, it's going to roll over a new digit. Okay, that is an OAuth method. It's actually a well-known, widely available, open source set of protocols so for open authentication. So all of those, like Google Authenticator or even Duo in some cases, use TOTP or time-based one-time passwords. And it generates your password using a time component and a secret. And so whenever the time rolls around and you've got your secret, it's going to smash them together and you're going to end up with your code. We're going to use one called HOTP. Instead of a time-based component, it uses a counter. So, these little USB ones here, there's nothing on there. There's no space for a battery to run a clock, anything like that. So it uses, when you plug it into the USB port, it uses the USB power. And every time you touch it, it's going to increment the counter. There's a little internal counter in there that's going to update every time you touch it. I think you can touch it, whatever hex works out to be, it's like 8F is how many times that you can have it. So it's 16 million touches. And I think the keys themselves are actually good for about 8 million touches is what they've tested so far before they just wear out and die. So the little short code that you get out of the end of these things is called an HMAC. I don't remember what HMAC actually stands for. I thought I had it in the slide, but it doesn't. It's not there. So that's kind of your comparison here between a hashed one-time password and a time one-time password. So in essence, you're taking the counter and the secret, smashing them together to get your short token, or you're going to take a time component and the secret and smash them together to get your short component. So that's really where they are. So instead of hashed one-time password or time one-time passwords, using hashed one-time passwords. So for our hashed one-time password provider, we are using YubiKeys by a fun company called YubiKey. And it just happens to be the one that I happen to have in hand is a YubiKey. There's actually quite a few HOTP providers. RSA used to be this way. They used to have almost like a little credit card shaped one that every time you pushed it, it would generate a new code. It was the same type of idea where it was using a hash component instead of a time component. There's even a way you can configure Google Authenticator to be an HOTP. And I didn't bother to go look into it, but this type of thing is also you can use with Google Authenticator. Or even if any of you guys use LastPass, you can set up an HOTP OAuth provider. So to program these YubiKeys, they actually give you a YubiKey customization tool. So this is what the screenshot looks like here, and I've actually numbered them. So each one of these YubiKeys has got two slots. It has a short press and a long press. So if you hold it down, just touch it, it's going to be slot 1. If you hold it down for 5 seconds, it's going to be slot 2, or at least 3 seconds. You're going to activate slot 2. So if you already have a YubiKey that's being used for something, you can actually configure the slot 2 to do something like this. Where the big changes are going to make is we're going to remove the OAuth token. And so that was that step number 2, taking that OAuth token. Like the previous YubiKey, the first piece of the token is going to be a static string. You know what? Let me just show you. I think that sounds like a much, much, much better idea. Let me just show you how this works. Okay. So if I take my regular YubiKey and I plug it in here, make sure that I'm on there. So come on. There it goes. So every time I touch this, it's generating a one-time password. This is the original format. And then you can see there's a pattern forming there at the beginning of the token where those don't change. That's called an OAuth token. So that's something that is going to identify, essentially it identifies the secret in the token. It's a lookup value for your token secret. Now, on the YubiKey that we're configuring using the screenshot behind this thing here, we're not going to get those big long ones. We're actually just going to get little 8-digit ones. So we're going to go ahead and we'll minimize this guy here. There. So, and how to configure that is, so we're going to also say, so step number 3 right there is a fixed 0, which means we want to start the counter at 0. Then the generate button, you have to remember to hit the generate button so it actually generates a random secret. And then you write the configuration to the YubiKey. If you're actually giving these to people, it's also kind of recommend that you configure this little section right here where you can actually lock the key from further configuration. So you can actually set a password on the configuration of your key. So, you know, no one can go in and modify it. When you write the configuration out, or when you write the configuration to the token, it's actually going to write it to the token, and there's going to be a CSV file that's generated out. That CSV file is going to have your secret in it, and it's going to have the name of your token, or the serial number from your token, and your token secret. That's the magic sauce that's going to make this work later. Okay, so really where this works and where this kind of magic happens to work handily here is, this was all developed in 2005. It was included with NMAS in 2007. Right now it's actually packaged in what they call their Identity Assurance Suite. When I tried to get the utility that actually takes the secret and saves it into the eDirectory thing with this new package 9 version, it didn't work. I had to go and grab a whole bunch of libraries from 8 to make the utility work, and then I think they've actually repackaged it now because I opened a service request with them, and they've repackaged it now so you can actually use it in 9. But all it is there's a utility called nmas HOTP conf. And I actually have what it is. So when you get the http.conf configuration, you can just extract it, you can run it, and then what we're looking at here, this is actually how I got it to work. So this is where I got the 8888 version and then had to extract things out of the eDirectory 8 RPMs to get the libraries I needed, so you didn't actually have to try to install all of 8 at once. Okay. All right. Yeah. Then, like I said, once it's all configured, you'll have a counter and the raw secret. So there's other OTP providers. Fortinet and SafeID are actually still ones that have a good mode here. So once you get that secret, then you have to set that secret into your user object in the directory. And it is by using this particular command here. So it wants the host that you're setting to, the port that you're setting to it, then the DN, or the fully distinguished name of a user that has rights to modify user objects. It doesn't necessarily have to be the admin, but for the sake of the demo, it's an admin user. Now, it has to happen over 636. So you have to have the key exported, the public certificate for your LDAP, you have to have the public certificate there. So inside of eDirectory, or inside iManager, you can export the public certificate of the certificate authority. And my blog one actually has all the steps on how to get your certificate out. Then T, so basically, well, what type of key, or what type of certificate is it? So this is a PEM certificate, so it's the base64 encoded certificate. It's the one you could actually read. It's not the binary certificate, because there's 2 certificate types. Okay, then R6Y6, those flags right there, that's setting the default counter, or the default window, and your user's window. Now, for example, I just used that token on my little Notepad++ there, and I pushed that token a whole bunch of times. So now the counter on that token does not match the counter in eDirectory. And if it has to match, that's a bad thing. So what they've done is that they know that you're going to press it. They know you're going to do things like that. So they've developed this mechanism in where you can have a sliding window. So the window here is 6. So I can push that token up to 6 times before it goes outside the window. It's not usable. Because really what happens behind the scenes is when I go to log in, eDirectory is going to take my login and my counter, and it's going to calculate the next 6 passwords and to see if the password I'm entering in is the same. Oh, I totally missed a whole huge step here. So this is the demo here. I'm going to walk over here so I can kind of point. So what happens here, so there's this, I'm using NDS login, my user ID is Mark, the container they're in users.gtopia, Gtopia is my domain. So I'm logging in with my password here is Marcus, and then I've attached that short token to the end of my password. So after I do the configuration using I'm going to step a little closer so I can point up higher. So up here, I've got this, I've done the configuration, I set my window to be 6, this is the user I'm going to set. It actually has 8 digits for its counter, or it's an 8-digit long token. My counter is set to 0. I'm going to enable the one-time password mechanism. And then the secret, this is the secret that was generated out, and this is a raw secret. So that's where all these little things come from. Now that I've enabled it, I'm trying to log in with my user and his password, and it's all like, you can't do that. Oh, I need to add my token. So I type in my password and I touch the token, and it's going to append its 8 digits to the end. That's really cool. Now, someone was looking over my shoulder, or I left it up on the screen like this, and someone's like, oh, I know what your password is. I can log into your system. And tries to reuse it. We can see it failed. It did not actually work. And so what I have to do is then I can say, oh, I've used the token. I put a new token on there, and now I have a successful login again. So you can see that you cannot have a replay attack. So it's a truly one-time password. The difference between like this hashed one-time password and say like Google Authenticator is if I have that, I can actually replay that password as many times as I want for a full minute until that time rolls over and the new token is generated. A hashed one-time password is a truly one-time password. When you do lockouts, it's the exact same type of thing. So you still have lockouts. I've tried it 6 times. You can see there, failed authentication, failed login lockout. So even if I'm doing anything, or if I try to replay it, you can still actually lock your account out. Okay, now comes the fun part, is configuring SSSD. The simple configuration for SSSD is coming in. I'm actually going to change, because what do we got here? There we go. So in the SSSD configuration, you want to make sure that you're going to enable, and this is the SSH key. Wow, that is really not complete. I was far worse off than I thought I really was. All right, so we're actually going to back out of the presentation here, and I'm going to pull up what things really look like. All right, so go away. Presentation now, kind of useless. We'll make sure we update it. This is actually me updating the presentation as we speak. Make sure I actually save it there. Okay. Now I have here in my grubby little mitts, I have 2 servers. I've got the server itself, so my LDAP.gtopia.org. This is actually a SLES server. My client is OpenSUSE, it's Leap42, but you can use this on just about any flavor that supports SSSD. So on my client here, which is what I'm going to show you now, is the SSSD configuration. So we'll go do the part where we actually had to add information here is on the domain. So we're actually going to configure an LDAP domain. We're going to give it the ID provider of LDAP. We're also going to give it the auth provider of LDAP, meaning that we're going to pull the oh, it's not up there. Thank you for, let's try this now. Hey, there we go. Is that big enough? Do I need to make it a little bit bigger? Please work. I can't make it bigger. it is, increase font size. There we go. Okay, so when we go to configure SSSD, first thing we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, we're still going to just use NSS and PAM. We're not doing sudo just a second, but we're going to configure a domain provider. So we're doing an LDAP provider. Now, the LDAP schema here is we're using this 3207 BIS. In this particular case, eDirectory stores the group membership attributes as the attribute name of member, and that's the difference between 2307 BIS and 2307. So if you see those two RFCs, and there's the BIS one, if you're using eDirectory, you want the BIS one. If you're using Open LDAP, you want the regular one. I don't know that Open LDAP actually has a method in it for the hashed one-time passwords. I know eDirectory has had it baked in for the last 11 years, which is why we're using it. All right, so moving through the configuration here. So there's my LDAP server, there's my user base. This is where my root certificate is. Make sure you actually 100% read the blog on this one here, because when you put the certificate into this folder, you actually have to run a rehash command so that it creates, I'll just show you. I don't know why I'm saying I do this, but I can show you. Thank you, I know it's a directory. Okay, so if you look inside this directory here, you can see how all of these certificate authorities have symbolic links. What these are is these are just hashes. There's a short hash of the subject line or the public part of the key. I don't remember exactly which one it is. But regardless, I can show you here. Grab. So there's my Gtopia root CA, and apparently I did this twice because there's two hashes in there. So instead of having to specify, and the reason I like to use the CA directory, because if I've got a system that's going to have multiple providers, I don't want to tell it, you have to use this CA for all your providers. It's like, this is the directory where all the CAs are, go find it in the directory. So it becomes, you don't limit yourself down by using that particular configuration. Okay. We do want it to create home directories because someone that logs in for the first time, we want it to make its home directory. And then, of course, I've created my company doesn't allow anonymous bind. So I have to turn off anonymous bind. So I need a bind account. So you can see here, I've got this this SSSD bind that I'm using a password, and that's actually the password, which I will promptly change after the session. There is a way that you can set up an obfuscated password. I just, again, ran out of time. So once you have this section done here, you can actually log into your Linux servers, and it's going to pull the information out of your directory. On the directory side of things, to configure your users, you have to make sure you extend the POSIX account schema over your users. So you can see in here that I'm going to have unique ID, which is Mark, and unique ID, so it's called unique ID on the NDS side, but on the LDAP side, it's UID. UID number, so it's 1001. Then, of course, my home directory, it's going to pull the home directory, because now when I log into client 1, get ent from password, Mark, and it's pulled that information straight from the LDAP server. And that's really kind of how you can kind of pre-test whether or not SSSD is actually working, is using the get ent command, because otherwise trying to log out and log back in and not have it work, and then trying to log using get ent says you have that basic functionality work. The biggest problem that I have to remember when I create a new user in a directory that doesn't have identity manager that's automatically adding the POSIX attributes for me, it's like, oh, I forgot to add the POSIX attributes to the user account. That's why he can't log into anything. So once the POSIX attributes are added, it just starts to work. Okay, so let's actually, take this one more step. I want to show you how this works. So I've got to, did I set a password on that? I did not. Okay, so I need to go and disable something really quick. I'm going to do it here because it's faster. This is for the second part of the demos. I actually have the SSH keys in here. So we're going to purposefully break it so you can see how login is Mark. It's asking for a password. I've typed in my password. If I just hit enter, it's going to fail. And assuming I haven't got my token too far outside the window, it lets me in by touching the YubiKey token. And so I was able to log in using a two-factor. Now, the next part of this here is like, okay, that's great, but I don't want to have to log in with the password every single time. I want to do SSH keys. And I don't have to copy, because I'm a lazy administrator, and laziness, I'll spend 40 hours to avoid 5 minutes worth of work. It's just kind of how dumb I am, apparently, some days. I don't want to have to copy my SSH public key to every single server I need to log into. Well, you can actually, and it's also on my blog. I took the schemas for Open LDAP or Sun1 directory server, and I modified the schemas to work in eDirectory and imported them. So now you can actually import this schema, which provides, it lets you have an SSH public key on your account. So it adds this attribute to it. So you can see that's the exact same line that you would have seen on a normal authorized key files. So yeah, that is my public key. So it's exactly the same line that you would see in your authorized keys. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and we're going to go back to PuTTY. The only reason I'm using PuTTY is because MobaXterm actually has my, it has the agent running on it, and it's set up to do some other weird things. So, but PuTTY just gives me that really, really vanilla experience, which is good for doing these type of demonstrations. If I can learn how to type, and I just lost it. PuTTY, I log in as client 1, I log in as Mark. And see, it took me all the way in, and it authenticated with my public key from the pageant agent that was running down there. I'm just doing this on Windows on purpose to show you that, hey, look, this stuff does work on Windows, and this is Windows 7. So if you don't have the luxury of having a Mac or a Linux workstation, you can do this on Windows. So the SSH login obviously wasn't two-factor. My private key, or my SSH key on my workstation has a password on it, so you could kind of argue. So I just closed that. So now if I were to do this again, you could kind of argue that, yeah, that's kind of two-factor, where you've got your public key and your SSH key, and then you're logging in, and you have to have a password on your SSH key, so that's kind of two factors. It's a weak two-factor. It's a soft certificate. So now if I do it without pageant running, so now it's asking me for a password, which is what I wanted to show. But we're going to go ahead and start up pageant again. So in my organization, logging in with a password for your own account is great. That's fine. It doesn't require two-factor. It's really when they start to get into, hey, you have privileged authentication. We really, really want to make sure that your privileged authentication is two-factor. I'm like, well, crap, how do we do that now? Da-da-da, enter this. So by having your low-powered account, or your normal user account, there's my private key in there. Having your normal account with an SSH key, which is arguably two-factor, kind of a weak two-factor. And now we've got sudo. And one of the things in this course is actually putting sudoers in LDAP. So inside Okay, let's make sure this is all nice and layered down. So we've got O equals Gtopia. There's a container here called sudo, and this container, of course, is just a simple, organizational unit container. However, go away. Don't need that search object there. However, there are these special containers in here called pseudo roles. So again, on my blog, I have the schema file that you can use to extend your LDAP schema to accommodate pseudo roles. So these are all the defaults. So this is the one of my favorite ones is actually taking this one, the insults. We're gonna turn the insults back on. I don't know if you guys have ever played around with that. So if you do sudo and type in the wrong password, it insults you. It's actually pretty funny. So we're going to take that there. And then this should look oddly familiar for the sudo host, the sudo options order. If this particular line were in the sudo file across the enterprise, what's wrong with this one here? What this would actually give, what's not necessarily wrong with it, but as an auditor, they would have a minor stroke, is because it says, I can log in as root on every single server that is configured for SSSD, which would be bad. So when you say host, this is actually where instead of saying all, you can actually limit it down by host. Now, doing this in LDAP also warrants us some extra attributes we can add. One of them is not before and not after. So if you're, as an administrator, I need to give someone sudo access over the weekend, I can actually go ahead and set it up as a not after and a not before. They have sudo access over the weekend. It's revoked at the end of the weekend, and that's it. I don't have to worry about it, so it self-cleans it up. Now, for someone in my organization where I've got the NetIQ Identity Manager, where I can say like, oh, I've got that whole provisioning system. Someone needs to request it. It's approved. I can simply create an LDAP object that has that privilege in it, that gives them the privilege over the weekend. It deletes it when it's done. It's all audited. And I can sleep on the weekend. I don't have to wake up at 3 a.m. to grant someone pseudo rights. Then the system can do it itself. So this is where my laziness, my desire to not work by doing more work pays off later because I get to sleep more. All right, so now that we've got this is exactly aligned. There's actually a utility out there called sudoers to LDIF. So if you've got a pretty big sudoers file, you can run the sudoers to LDIF, and it will actually create the LDIF for you to create your rules and import them into LDAP. The last thing, too, is that this one thing I want to say, that, hey, this is the big kind of gotcha, is the pseudo order. So when you call every object from an LDAP container, what order do they come back in? Whatever their server feels like it. There is no precedent for order. Now, sudoers files, as everyone knows, they are very, very highly dependent on order because first match wins. So you can get some really, really bizarre results without these ordering constraints. So you can actually take all of your rules and you can give them some sort of sane order. So that's how you order things, because every leaf object in this LDAP container is like its own line of sudoers. You can do groups. You have to use the syntax for like an NIS group. You can't use like the %wheel. But if you do the syntax as if it were an NIS group, it actually does use the local wheel group. Or if you've configured SSSD to do its group to be the group identity provider, it can use those groups as well. So you can still bring all of that into a single directory instead of having to administer every single server individually. All right, this option here, authenticate, if you put an exclamation point in front of this, that's the same thing as if you were to say you can run this command with no password. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that we enforce a password, because that's our point here. We want to make sure that when the user Mark runs this command to become root, it's going to force a password. So let's go ahead and we're going to do this again, and we're going to log into client 1. The login is Mark, and it should take me right in. Now I want to do sudo SU. I want to become root. Now it's asking for my password. MARKUS. And I forgot to tap my YubiKey. It's not going to let me in. Now I am going to touch the YubiKey. And now I've got root access on the box. So there's my privileged access that is now two-factor enforced. Whew, that is a lot of information. Okay, that's really kind of basically the end of my demo. So what questions do we have? Comments, catastrophes, observations of discussed or otherwise? Go ahead.
Could you just show us the current configuration of the SSSD con?
Yes. Oh, that is a very good thing. I'm glad you mentioned that. Okay, so the SSSD conf?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so configuring SSSD to, because SSSD, or triple SD, is, I have to remember that, triple SD, which is easier, but hard habits die fast. Triple SD is actually handling our sudoers configuration. So the Pseudo Provider is LDAP. Then you have sudo search base. So this is the container where all my sudoers rules are. So if you really do have the need to have, say, this set of servers needs a different set of sudo rules than this set of servers, you can easily just set up two separate containers. So you can actually segregate sudoer files that way. Debug I've got set to 2 right now. And in some cases, for example, this is an AWS instance, so I'm actually running all my demos out of Amazon Cloud right now. The host name gets changed back to the private IP address, which is this guy right here. But that's not what I want to do. I actually want to call it client 1. So in my, and this is something I didn't actually have time to do the demo for, I wanted to restrict it down to client 1 in there, but where my host name is something else. So you can actually say this LDAP pseudo host names, you can force a client name instead of triple SD trying to figure out what the client name is or what the host name is for that. There's one other little piece of magic on here. If you notice in here, these are all commented out for the Active Directory stuff. There's nothing in here talking about SSH keys. Now in triple SD, there's a lot of configuration options for triple SD doing SSH keys. In this particular case, it's kind of a red herring because SSH public keys in triple SD only work with IPA. So if you're using the IPA provider, you can put your SSH keys there, that's fine. But in this particular case where we're just using an LDAP provider, those public, the SSH provider in triple SD does not work. So we're going to back out one here. And what you have to do is you have to configure, you have to create this file. So you can actually configure your sudoers file, I'm sorry, your SSH file can have a separate LDAP configuration than your regular system LDAP configuration. So you don't have to worry about someone going and monkeying around with etc open LDAP, ldap.conf. If someone changes that file, it's not going to break your SSH configuration. So they've actually separated that file as a good measure of making sure that SSH daemon isn't monkeyed around with inadvertently. You can also configure a different bind agent or bind password. It looks very similar. Also because everything, like I have auditors that actually put wire sniffers out. They sniff the traffic. If they see anything going around clear text, you get flagged for it and have to answer to it. So everything has to be secure. I like doing things with certificates instead of doing that like TLS rec cert never, which says I'm just going to trust any certificate you throw at me. I want to make sure I'm actually talking to a trusted source, especially when you're dealing with something like public cloud. You want to make sure that that someone's not trying to man in the middle you. All right, and then the last little piece on here, the NSS switch. Okay, you have to add this line right here, sudoers triple S. This is what tells the regular operating system that the sudoers is not going to the file but you're going to go talk to SSS for it. Now, SSS also has a configuration where you can say, I'm going to get sudoers from LDAP, but you can also still use the file as a backup. So it's not one or the other, it is both. And that's kind of the big flexibility piece with using SSSD, is that it's not going to force you to do one way. You can have your cake and eat it too, type of thing. All right, that was a good question because it made me realize I missed a whole part of my configuration here. Any other questions? Go ahead.
You talked about this window that you have, so 6 different attempts on the configuration that you showed. Is the sync up after successful authentication?
Yes, that's a good question, and there's actually one other piece there I'll share with you as well. So let's say that I've pushed my YubiKey 5 times, like I did in this demonstration here. And so the counter on my YubiKey, which can't go backwards, is at 5. The counter on the directory was at 1. Okay? When I logged in, the directory was going to calculate my next 6 passwords, find one that matches, and then it's going to update the counter in the directory to the current counter on the token. So it's going to end up matching it. So it's going to skip those numbers in the directory. And it says the next question, which is kind of the lead-in question there, well, what happens if I've pressed the YubiKey 7 times and I'm outside the window? There is an option on here. Oh, and then also if you want to enable it or disable it, so like for a short period of time, say I left my token at home, you can actually come in here, the SAS OTP enabled. If you uncheck that and then actually hit OK, then you can disable the token. So if there's something you need to do without the token, then or something that you need to do that needs to, like, because there's some really, really bad tools out there that cache your password and want to log in with that same cached password over and over and over and over again. That doesn't work with a one-time password. So in that particular case, you can there's a way around it. But to answer the other question, is this OTP Resync. So if I get my token outside the window, I can come in here to the resync and put in like 99. And then what it's going to do is for the next authentication attempt, instead of only calculating 6, which is the default that I set, it's going to calculate the next 99 to try to find a match. And as you can guess, calculating that many passwords is a little bit more resource intensive. So that's why it only does it once. It resyncs the token, resyncs the counters, and then you're good to go going forward. That's a good question as well. You had a question back there. Go ahead.
Is it possible to integrate other authentication methods other than one-time password, like PKA or biometrics?
That is a good question. I don't know. Conceivably, yes. However, there's a gotcha on this one. The reason that I like this particular method is that it requires 0 client configuration. So anything that's got username, password, I can enforce two-factor authentication just by virtue of enabling this here, because all I'm doing is I'm modifying the password. If you have something that requires that second box or another authentication piece, you're looking at some other type of a framework on top of that as well. If you're dealing just within the Linux platform like PAM, for example, instead of using the hash one-time password, I want to use the big long the original YubiKey. YubiKey has a radius server that can authenticate the YubiKeys. And assuming that SSSD finishes their radius provider, I can say, like, I need both providers. I log in with my username, password, and the radius one, which would be the YubiKey, and then it would let me in. So anything that was using that kind of generic logging, because it will prompt you again for that. Also, YubiKey does have a PAM method as well if you want to use the original PAM thing. But as far as like biometrics and stuff, yeah, you're looking at another framework. Typically, what
Hardware tied to hardware, very tied to hardware.
right. What I've typically seen in that scenario, when someone has, I've got this other method, say they're using a secure login, is your directory password is actually a really, really big, long password that you don't know what it is. And so your biometric piece actually will actually retrieve your big, long, scary password and then inject it into things. And so that's typically what I see when someone's trying to do that. It's like we have to have a biometric piece in there. I don't know that SSSD has a PKI provider just yet, but I'm sure that's very, very well in the road works, because that's something that the LDAP can do very easily is do PKI. You know, and that one still does require some client modification. Cool, good question, thank you. All right, go ahead.
So the password, when you press the YubiKey, are you typing in a password and hitting the YubiKey?
Right, yeah.
How does it parse that? How does it know how to parse that?
Sure, I'll show you exactly. So I'm on the LDAP server right here. Let me plug this YubiKey in again. Let's go like this. Okay, so I'm using this NDS login method. So basically, I'm authenticating it directly against the server. You can also do the exact same thing with like an LDAP search or an LDAP modify or something like that. So my password is Marcus. Okay. You can see it doesn't like that. So, but when I put the token on the end of it, it actually lets me in. When you set up that using that nmaz HP conf configuration utility, one of the parameters that you're setting on there is the token length. It can either be 6 digits or 8 digits. So eDirectory is always going to know that the last 8 digits of your, or the last 8 characters of your password are going to be this hash token. So it's simple substringing. That answer your question? Cool. All right. Go ahead and back.
How do you deal with cached passwords or proxy access?
For the SSSD configuration, you turn cached passwords off, because you can't. It's truly a one-time password. If you were able to know what you had pressed, so let's say you pressed the key in another window, and then you're able to log in with that password. This is really an online-only type of method. So it's not for disconnected. Your LDAP server needs to be highly available type of thing. Yeah. So for the SSSD cache password, yeah, you've got to turn that off. Most other applications, you're going to be along the lines of, hey, you need to take and do your LDAP connections right, or do your authentication right, where you authenticate once and don't try to save the password to reuse it later. So if you need like a session token, then you need to establish some other sort of session mechanism in there instead of trying to just reuse a password.
Yeah, I just want to outline that a general problem of this one-time password is that all other applications that authenticate the same eDirectory in that case need to be capable to handle one-time passwords also. So for the LDAP logging and the S login, that's fine, but if you have other protocols connected, you might run into a problem.
That's correct. So one example we had is we had a management utility for a database. And the database itself was LDAP authenticated. Now, every query you made to this database had to be authenticated query. So it's trying to, so the utility, this management utility would cache your password and try to reuse it. And so in that case, this type of password utility does not work. And how you get around that particular one is Kerberos. So you can use this type of method to get your ticket granting ticket, and then when you're Kerberized, then there's no more password exchange. So that's the next step in this. Is like, okay, now that we've got all this stuff all set up and fancy, now we can even go take it a step further and we introduce Kerberos into the mix. So now there's no more password exchange. The only password exchange that happens is when you're getting your ticket granting ticket from the KDC. Cool. That's a good question. Yeah, and that is a problem. So that's right. You have to be very cognizant of what exactly you're trying to do. If there's no more questions, we'll go ahead and give you guys 5 minutes back of your day. Go ahead and back. Oh, yes. My blog. Okay. My blog is gtopia.org. And so in here, this is where you can extract the certificates, and this is the actual one for this presentation. So in here, I've got instructions on how to extract your self-signed certificate, because most of your eDirectories are going to have self-signed certificates. Exactly what you need to extract the files as. This is the how to set up your LDAP.conf. So you can actually do like LDAP search and things like that. So on your system itself, you can kind of say, hey, I like to get it set up as much as I can using the native tool. So doing open LDAP, LDAP.conf, setting that up pretty well. It helps with later troubleshooting. So this is a test search when I was looking for SSSD stuff. Here's actually how to enable SSSD on SUSE, this is the command that you run. So this pam-config, add the configuration for SSSD and add the configuration for make home directory. Because if we were to go look at the authentication PAM stack, you would see a SSS.so module in the PAM configuration as well. Then here's the schema. Here's an LDAP schema that you can, the LDIF-based LDAP schema that you need to extend the schema on your tree. This schema here has been modified to work with eDirectory. Let's see here. This is the sudoers one, because you have to modify the schema again to be able to do sudoers in LDAP. Here's just a short schema here on how to, you can see here where I've got the exclamation point authenticate, which is the same as saying no password. Here's the SSSD.conf, and I'll put my most recent one out here as well for that. And then this is the last piece I was working on here, is configuring your SSH keys in LDAP. That was the last piece there. So then let's see, SSHD config. Inside of your SSHD configuration, to get it to work, you have to add in, I'm on the server, that's why it's not there. Okay, these two lines right here. So these are built into SUSE. So SUSE provides this SSH-LDAP-wrapper, which is a wrapper around SSH helper, which actually which calls that, it uses the built-in system LDAP libraries along with the etc SSH LDAP.conf configuration to pull the authorized key, or pull your public key out of your user object. So those are that's the change that you have to make to your SSHD configuration in order to pull those public keys from LDAP. And I'll also put my email address up here as well. Okay, this is my So that's my email address and my website. If you guys do happen to get stuck on this, I'm a nice guy, I'm not really a jerk. Be able to help you out with some configuration or troubleshooting, or if you see something wrong in my configuration, then it's like, hey, this isn't how it worked when you did your class. So there, that's something. That's my personal email address that I'll share with you there. So if you guys have any questions, all right. Are there any more questions? All right, well then, we're done then. Thanks for coming, guys. I appreciate it.
Hey, nice session. Just want to give you one more tip. I'm using the same method in some deployments, and there are soft tokens for mobile phones.
Right, there are.
And maybe when you talk again about that,
What are you using for your soft token?
I'm using an app from, is it Sophos?
Yes. Okay, no worries. Yeah, we're already pushing it with 2 laptops.
Authenticator, yes.
It's just called